Today we are going to look at GDP and it is criticism. What to those who criticize or oppose the idea of using GDP to measure total production, what do they say? What is wrong with GDP? That's our topic today. We know that GDP is gross domestic product. Gross domestic product is the total production in a country, and the formula used to measure GDP is to calculate all investments or consumption or government expenditure. Then you subtract the net exports, that is the exports minus imports for a certain country. So GDP, according to many feminist economists and Austrian economists, they say that GDP is not a correct or is not a perfect measure of a country's standard of living or of a country's well-being. One of the reasons why they say that GDP is not a good measure of a country's well-being or macroeconomic health of a country is because it does not take into consideration the issues in or the trade in black market, such as trade in drugs, prostitution, and other black market exchanges. That is one. The second reason why GDP is not a good thing to use to determine a country's economic well-being or macroeconomic well-being is because GDP does not really tell us what's the distribution of those goods which we are talking about. For example, if you say GDP of a country is 10 or 50 billion US dollars, that's good. We know that is the total GDP or the total production of a country, and that is what it's supposed to tell us. But the problem is, once it has told us that is the GDP of a certain country, we look at the GDP per capita. That is how much should, if we were to subdivide the GDP by the population, how much each person could get. That's what we call GDP per capita. It doesn't tell us how these goods are distributed, but it tells us that just a general figure, a huge monetary figure, a lump sum figure. So if we are comparing the GDP per capita of a certain country, for example Kenya and South Africa, if we say GDP per capita in Kenya is $2,000 US dollars, and in South Africa is $3,000 US dollars, we can't say that South Africa is doing better than Kenya because of a huge GDP per capita. Because we do not know how many people in that country, for example in South Africa, own or get that GDP per capita. How many people? What's the distribution of this production? Is it mostly towards a few people in the country, or is it reaching to everyone? So there is the issue of inequality. We can have a higher GDP per capita, but it is going only to a few people in the society. Another issue why GDP is not a perfect measure of a country's macroeconomic health or well-being is because the formula for calculating GDP or the formula for calculating the total production includes government. And we know governments are very inefficient in terms of expenditure. They can spend on programs which are not productive compared to the private sector or the private companies. Private companies can invest very well on programs or projects which can be very productive. But governments mostly they spend on infrastructure and other programs which might not be very beneficial to the society. And we know that they are very wasteful in terms of spending. So there are prominent economists around the world who are making an argument that the government expenditure should not be part of GDP because it is not a true reflection of expenditure or of the total production. Finally, GDP is not a fair measure of a country's or a nation's production because household production is never included in GDP. For example, if I wash my own car, I iron my own clothes, I cook my own food, it means I will not be paid. But according to me, or according to many people, that is also production which should be included in the GDP formula. A number of feminist economists have argued that women's production, especially housewives, is never included in GDP. They do a lot of work. They clean their houses or their family houses. They cook. They do a lot of things. They care for the family. Ordinarily, that is labor which should be documented and paid for. But in most cases, in most countries, the women's production has never been included in GDP, considering that they bring a lot into the table. So, we can argue that GDP is not a good measure of the total production in a country. We can't say GDP is representative of all people, especially women. It is unfair to them. Their production, which is unpaid for, is never included in this GDP. So if women take care of children, take care of the family, cook for the family, do the washing, and that is labor, the fact that they are not paid, that labor or that production should not be excluded from the GDP. Up to that point, I hope you have learned one or two things about gross domestic product, total, which is supposed to be a measure of total production of a country, but it is not, according to many arguments from prominent economists and from ordinary people like me and you. GDP should be revised. It should come up with a new formula of calculating a country's macroeconomic health instead of using GDP. Thank you very much for tuning in to Kerosi TV. Until another time I see you on the internet, kindly subscribe before you leave. Thank you.